Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this special broadcast, giving you an in-depth look into our campaign, Our Pride, Our Safety. I'm Orie, the Director of Communications for the New York City Anti-Violence Project. And throughout this broadcast, we invite you to participate in the conversation by using the live chat. You'll need to be signed in to YouTube to comment. We'd love to hear from you. Please take a minute to say hi now in our live chat and let us know where you're joining from. I'm also joined by our Executive Director of AVP, Tillery. Beverly, how are you doing today? Thanks for joining us for this important conversation.
Hi, Orie. It's really great to be here with you. And welcome to AVP.
Thank you so much. It's been a great couple of weeks so far. We're doing a lot of great work here, and I'm really excited to get this conversation started. We're really beginning the new wave of an old conversation. It's how do we keep our LGBT community safe? And it's a question AVP has answered daily through our programs and services for more than 40 years. But it's also a bigger question that our community needs to solve too. It's a question of what we value, a question of what resources we need and how we pay for them. It's prioritizing the safety needs of our most marginalized in our communities and building the solutions that work for all of us. It's challenging the structures that prevent our community from realizing those solutions and working to build what we need beyond them. So today we're going to begin our conversation exploring why our communities need to reimagine what we see as safety, including the unique challenges we face within our communities. Then we'll talk about the possibilities of new models of safety. It's not just about guns or guarding property. Real safety protects someone's whole being and sense of stability. And finally, we can't build this model without you. We'll tell you how you can get involved in our ongoing conversations and actions around community safety building. You can engage with us right now on social media at Anti-Violence or right here in the chat, and we'll leave some time at the end for your questions. So let's get right into the discussion and hear directly from our Executive Director, Tillery. Now, Bev, organizing our communities has become your life's work. I want you to tell us about this campaign and why it's important not just for LGBTQ people, but for everyone. And to do that, we're going to start with a statistic. We know that LGBTQ people are 4 times as likely. 4 times as likely. That's how much more likely we are, according to the Williams Institute, to experience violence than non-LGBTQ people. Let's start with that statistic and what it means for this campaign, Bev.
Yeah. Again, I want to say happy Pride to everyone. I'm really excited to dig into this conversation, particularly on the eve of Pride weekend, as we've been celebrating and talking about Pride throughout the month. All across the country. That statistic is really one of the reasons why AVP was founded in the first place. The fact has been true for a really long time that our community is much more likely to experience violence. And those issues of violence that we experience, whether it's violence that's interpersonal violence, violence from the state, police violence, hate violence, violence from other folks attacking our community, all of the ways that we experience violence for many years went really unaddressed by the institutions that were put in place to protect our community. And because those incidents of violence were going unaddressed in New York City, our community members came together to form AVP. They founded a hotline, really looking to protect each other, to look out for each other, to document the violence that was going on, and to provide services and support to community members, knowing that we couldn't rely on other institutions to give us safety. We had to build it for ourselves. And we're really returning to this conversation about community-led safety. We've done it for years. We've known how to do it for years. But now this is an opportunity for us to think about how do we scale that community-led safety that we've done so well on a small scale for so long? How do we really apply that to all of the ways that we experience violence in all parts of our lives in our community? And what can we do to make sure that our communities have the resources that we need to identify the problems related to safety and the solutions that we need to address that safety, and then implement those solutions ourselves?
Absolutely, Bev. And kind of as you alluded to, this is a multi-layered issue. These problems are intersecting. There are many levels to them. But the bottom line is that as LGBTQ people, we're typically under-resourced, we're underreported, and we're underprotected. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Why is our community much less safer than other communities, Bev?
Well, I think that there's so many different reasons. What I will say is that this moment right now in time is really highlighting some of the long-standing societal, institutional issues that are at play here that make our communities not safe. We are seeing across the country in real time right now all of the attacks on our community, that are reaffirming the ways in which our community is not valued in our society, is not protected by the larger society. Our rights are being threatened on a daily basis. We're reeling from what we knew was coming, but the Supreme Court ruling that was announced today on Roe v. Wade is just one example of the ways that the institutions that we've relied on, or we hoped we could rely on for years, to protect us, are failing us over and over. We're seeing sweeping efforts to push through legislation in every state across this country practically to reverse rights that we've worked hard to build up. And we are seeing white supremacist attacks on our communities and others that are marginalized in our society. So fundamentally, you have to talk about the homophobia and the transphobia and the racism that exists and is really getting even more of a platform in our society right now, that is underneath a lot of the violence that we experience, right? That we experience that in the form of discrimination in the workplace, in the form of hate violence in the street, attacks to our community and our organizations. You have to start there when you're looking at the violence that we experience.
And these aren't isolated, right? It seems like, all of these communities are experiencing these things, just not just LGBTQ people, people of color, people who are marginalized in many different ways are really experiencing what we are feeling now is kind of a lack of support, a lack of our feelings of self, and a lack of being protected and feeling safe. Um, Tell me more about these structures. We have this Supreme Court decision. People look to the Roe v. Wade case as something that championed women's rights and bodily autonomy rights. And now that's no longer in this country. So, what does it mean to not have our institutions protect our needs? And what do we do about that?
Yeah. To some extent in the LGBT community, we have always had the reality that our institutions were not fully protecting our needs. And so, I think that this is a wake up call for some, but it is just the reality for others. Particularly those of us who hold multiple marginalized identities, multiple identities that are regularly oppressed in our society. Those are the folks who are already most impacted by violence, and the folks that really we need to think about as we prioritize ways that we can create safety together. Because when we focus on the folks who have already historically are experiencing the most violence in our society, when we figure out how to make them safe, we're going to make all of us safe. I know when I can look at my trans sisters and talk to them and hear from them that they feel safe going to work, walking in their communities, being out on the streets. If they're going to be safe, I'm going to be safer. And we will all be safer. So, I think that when you think about, sort of the institutions and the violence, we have to think about how do we, instead of just relying on those institutions, what are ways that we can create safety ourselves? And at AVP, we've been doing this for over 40 years. It started with our hotline, but it hasn't ended there. We're doing safety planning with people individually and collectively, groups, every day, and helping people think about what are the things that you need in this moment to make you safe, but also what are the things that as a community we need long term, to not just address incidents of violence one by one, but how do we prevent the violence from occurring? And ultimately, the institutions that we rely on are never going to be about prevention. They're only going to be about punishing and, dealing with individual instances of violence.
So when we're dealing with this situation where we have these institutions that don't protect us or meet the needs of what we need for our protection, and then we have this very real, ongoing, everyday threat that many people are facing in our community safety, it looks like the solution. It looks like we need to find ways to protect ourselves. So let's talk a little bit more about that and what we think of when we think of community safety. Because I think some people have some misconceptions. They have some different conceptions about what it means. So from your perspective, Bev, what is community safety and what does it mean for us?
Yeah. First of all, it's folks in the community coming together to have those conversations. And at AVP, we've been doing this, both individually and collectively. A few years ago, we, decided that we would bring together community members, who are trans and gender nonconforming and non-binary, to talk about what makes them safe. And over and over and over again, people talked about not just, those immediate things that would make them feel safer when they walk the streets, but those larger institutional problems that need to be addressed. People would say if we could have adequate housing, we would be safer, in the city. If we could have better access to jobs, that will pay us well, and that value us for the talents that we bring to our society, we will be safer. So there are, sort of these larger issues that really make up a picture, of what safety looks like. And ultimately, our communities have to be given the space to come together, to shape what we need, as a community to make us safe, and then given the tools and the resources to put those systems into practice. And right now, unfortunately, we've spent so much of our resources as a society, as a city, as a community, investing in systems that are really about punishment, and not about prevention and solutions. That we really, this is the time to really, you know, to take a stand and say, um, let's take some of those resources and invest it in, long-term solutions that are going to address the real needs of our community.
Absolutely. It's the resources piece is so important because we can't do any of this work without the resources needed to do the work. And those are financial resources, those are human resources. It really takes a collective effort on both fronts. I want to talk about an incident that, or I won't say incident, but I want to talk about a recent collaboration because of some unfortunate incidents that have happened. As you said, AVP has always been in this space, helping communities, helping groups, helping individuals stay safe. And we've recently connected with the organization Drag Queen Story Hour. Because unfortunately, the real situation that's happening right now is that Drag Queen Story Hour events across the country are being targeted and threatened and even attacked. And people are feeling very unsafe. And there was an incident where the people that were supposed to protect those individuals actually didn't really. They escorted the protesters in to make the situation unsafe. So tell me about this situation, this partnership with Drag Queen Story Hour, and why these community partnerships are so important, not only for safety, but for community-led safety.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I will say that we have been tracking the attacks and the threats against Drag Queen Story Hour now for several years. Um, they have been not completely singled out, but definitely targeted by a number of white supremacist groups. I think as a symbol of, in some ways, so much of what we in our community celebrate and that we as a society should be celebrating. Um, Drag queens taking their time to go read stories to children in libraries and community centers, and sending the message about inclusion and the importance of all of us being valued in society. What's not to love about that? And so, as we saw these attacks happening again this year, we were monitoring the reports that were happening in different parts of the country. In at least one occasion, folks in the community decided to not have the Drag Queen Story Hour because they were worried about the threats. And so our rapid incident response team reached out to Drag Queen Story Hour's leadership and really offered to help in any way that we could. And they were really interested in having AVP help train their members across the country about ways that they could actually employ community-led safety that was led by and run by community members who wanted to support Drag Queen Story Hour. How they could employ this themselves, what they could do, how they could be proactive as they plan for events, and really thinking about what are the conditions that they need to create to make sure that not only the drag queens were safe, but the community members coming out, the families, the children, who are safe, and really also to send a message that we are not going to back down. We are not going to stop having these events, because people are bringing hate into our communities. And in fact, we are going to celebrate these events. We're going to have people come out and support them. And so even here in Brooklyn, I was really excited to see after this training that folks got mobilized. Saw people who answered the call to come out and support Drag Queen Story Hour, and they had their lawn chairs out, and really there to provide safety and support as community members themselves, responding and saying, this is going to happen. We're going to be here to protect. And we are community members that are trained and knowledgeable about how to de-escalate, how to intervene in situations, and how to support each other.
And I think that's really the important point, is that it's community helping community. It's that mutual understanding of what is needed and providing that support in that time. That's really what we're talking about here in this conversation with community safety, right? It's bringing that into our community and framing it for our needs. But we
That's
can't
right.
do it.
And
Yeah,
can I also just say, Orie,
yeah.
imagine if Drag Queen Story Hour defense teams were funded all across the country, right? That people didn't, it wasn't just about, individual people who want to volunteer, but there was actually a concerted effort to make this institutional, that could be utilized not just for Drag Queen Story Hour, but for other instances where our communities are threatened. And like you said before, we're not just talking about things that happen in the LGBTQ community. These are processes and structures that we need in place for all of our community, that should be able to be mobilized, that should be resourced, that should be available to everybody.
It's very prudent that you mentioned that point of if it were funded, because that's a big component of this, right? We need to shift resources. We need to be able to scale our programs. We've been able to do a lot with what we have, but if we had more, we would be able to do more. So talk to me about what that scaling looks like. What's that vision for how we grow things like these partnerships with community organizations to help determine safety?
Yeah. Well, there is no shortage of ideas about how to do this, even experience. And what really is lacking, as you said, is the resources and also the institutional will to support this work and to recognize that it is and should be a part of um, our overall society's um, response to and plan for violence prevention, right? These should not be sort of one-off activities that pop up here or there. There should really be an effort to think about what would it take to make this happen all the time, to make this available to all community members. So I think first is the imagination, right? And to not just imagine that violence prevention or addressing violence is just about um, armed forces coming in and responding when something happens, looking to punish people. Um, but we can have the imagination of ways that our community can come together to support each other, that will keep people safe, not just come in after we've been harmed. So I think that's first. And then secondly, um, it's not like we don't have money. Our city and, city budgets all across the country are using lots and lots of resources, have lots and lots of dollars. And it's really just about us deciding how we want to invest those resources, what is most important to us as a society. Um, just in New York City alone, our police department is funded to the tune of, I believe, $11 billion. Um, and just a fraction of those resources could be used to seed, to test programs like the ones that we're describing, to find creative and new ways to look at how do we scan our communities and identify the ways that people will be at risk, and then work to alleviate those underlying problems that put people at risk. Um, our social services and um, our support network for people who are most harmed in our society is very, very limited. We know every day that people in our community come to us at AVP because they're struggling to find, in some cases, places to get adequate food, to be housed safely. Because even when you have an emergency and a need, the shelter system is not a safe place for you if you're an LGBTQ, if you're a queer person, particularly if you're a queer person of color, if you're a trans person. Um, all of these, um, all of these pieces of our safety net that are supposed to be there for people often do not serve the LGBTQ community adequately anyway. So think about all of the resources that we have that are being directed towards things that are not serving us or keeping us safe. And let's figure out ways to reallocate some of those funds so that the community can really, again, be having a say and building policy along with the leaders who are supposed to be protecting us, and putting some of those things into practice. They're not all going to work right away. Um, but we also know that the things that we are doing right now are not working. So it's time to really allow ourselves to vision something different, and to start to really support us to test out those systems. We've had, hundreds and hundreds of years of investment in systems that are not working for us, and it's time to do something different.
And thinking about those systems that aren't working for us, we're talking about really focusing our efforts on what those most marginalized need, those in our community who are experiencing the most barriers to living their full, safe lives. When we talk about that, centering those survivors, centering LGBTQ folks, what does that look like in comparison to what we have now?
Yeah. It's interesting because I still hear from folks a lot, from individuals who say, well, I feel safe. So I think things must be working. And so when we say that we're centering people who are most impacted by violence and who are most marginalized, we really mean, one, talking to those folks, really leading from a place of identifying the ways and the things that need to be put in place to make those people feel safer. And then um, creating our solutions to really prioritize those needs, but also knowing that when we prioritize those needs, then everybody's going to be a little bit safer. So I can just give you one example. I was actually just recently reading uh, um, a story from one of AVP's former clients. We've been embarked on this process where we have been highlighting some of the change makers in our community over the 40 years of AVP's existence. And I was reading a story of a trans man, former client of AVP, who got arrested during some of the Occupy Wall Street um, protests. And he was arrested with a group of people on the Brooklyn Bridge. And a number of people got arrested together. They were all taken to a local Brooklyn precinct and held. And he was in a cell with a group of other men who got arrested in the protest. And as soon as the police officers learned that he was trans, they removed him from that cell. And instead of finding another place to house him, which wasn't necessary in the first place, they actually chained him to a structure in the police station by the bathroom. And while the other folks who had got arrested were given sandwiches and drinks while they were being held, he was not. And the whole night he remained chained by the bathroom, being taunted, ridiculed by everybody in the station. And so I think about him a lot because, for folks who say, things have changed, things are changing, they're not changing fast enough to protect real people who are in harm's way every day when they encounter our criminal legal system, unfortunately. And so when I think about centering folks who are most impacted, I think about, okay, what would have made that trans man safer in that situation? And you can come up with a number of things, right, that would have made him safer. You, can think about, you know, what in that situation, what would have happened if the officers had asked him what he would need to feel safe being held. And he might have said, I'm fine in this cell where I am right now with my comrades who I got arrested with, who we were a part of this protest. Because sometimes we're told that these things are happening to us because they're being done for our own protection. So, having a direct conversation, what would it have um, taken to create a situation in which those officers um, felt like they wanted to treat him with respect and dignity. Um, it's not about individual officers who are acting out in that moment. This was a whole station, right? So it really goes to show you the systemic discrimination that is underlying in our criminal legal system. That, not only officers, but everybody who was in that station was given the message, whether it was direct or indirect, that this was somebody that whose life was not to be valued, who did not deserve the respect of being treated like a human being, being treated like other people who had been arrested in the same protest. Um, and ultimately, what it would take for that person, for that trans man, to really be treated well is a whole restructuring of that system, that criminal legal system that has told everybody in it, since the day it started, that somebody like that trans person does not deserve to be respected. Um, and so I think we have to imagine, um, even what we think of when we talk about safety, right? It's not just saying, we're taking people who are most marginalized and we're trying to change the structures so that maybe they will be safer, maybe people will treat them with more respect. No, we have to start with a place of, how do we demand and ensure that the respect is happening? And then all of the other things will fall from there. Um, I think about a lot of times when I'm walking down the street, um, you know, thinking about not just what would make me safer in this situation, but what would make other people in our community who I know are more impacted by violence, what would make them safer? Um, just another example, I have a 16-year-old daughter. And I know when I walk down the street, I don't hear the catcalls and the harassment that she probably hears every day of her life. So, as I'm walking down the street, if I'm centering somebody who is more impacted by violence and thinking about a young 16-year-old Black girl, who might experience street violence and harassment in a different way than I experience, then I think about what would be the conditions that we would need to create so that people would not feel like they had the right, or the need to be able to, treat her that way. And, that's the same for trans women of color. Um, you know, how do we change both the attitudes and the structures in our society ultimately, so that those in our community who are experiencing the daily onslaught of violence in the way that maybe we are not experiencing, don't have to experience that anymore? And really, if we listen to those folks, if we talk to them, they know and they will tell us. And all we have to do is, be in solidarity with them and work to achieve their vision of safety. Again, because it's going to make us all safer.
So it really just comes down to those things that we all learned, listening. We learned
Mm,
practicing empathy, right? These things that are supposed to be a part of our society, that seem to have kind of not become such a part of our society these days, some might say. When you're talking about the centering of these most affected people, which I think really hits home the message, because all of us experience this world differently. We all present ourselves differently to the world, and the world gives back to us differently. So how can we encourage people who maybe don't experience this violence, or who don't see, what the most marginalized are experience? How do we convey the importance to them that this is their fight as well?
yeah. I mean, look, I think times like now, if you don't see it, it's really hard to imagine. we are seeing our community being attacked on all levels. And those attacks are impacting all of us. But we saw a few years ago, these attacks, against trans folks in our community. Um, and for some of us, we took heed and we paid attention as we started noticing the homicides of trans women of color, increasing, continuing to increase. Um, I think a lot of folks now are paying attention to that and understand that it's not just the fight of trans women of color, or gender nonconforming and non-binary folks. It's all of our fight, because those attacks are being used to attack all of us. Um, and so, yes, I think, it's becoming even more clear every day, right? We talked about the Supreme Court decision and how that decision may be used to continue to strip more communities of rights, right? More communities who are traditionally discriminated against of rights that we have come to expect. That is right on all of our back doors. It is actually at our front doors right now. So I think that all you have to do is really pay attention to what's going on in our society. It's not hard to see these things. And if for some reason you're still struggling and still feeling like it's not your fight, um, just talk to folks in your community. Maybe the folks that you don't normally talk to. Go and get involved with organizations that are led by trans folks that are working to address the needs of the most marginalized folks in our community, that are led by people of color. We do have to take some responsibility for informing ourselves, and then for, hearing what we're hearing from folks, believing what we're hearing, and getting involved. But really, it doesn't take much to see what's happening in our society and how the attacks are really all of our attacks, how the fight is really all of our fight. And the solution has to be all of our solution. We can't, we just don't have the luxury anymore to sit back and say, I think I'm okay, because we're not okay. Our communities are being harmed and traumatized on a daily basis. And it's going to take all of us to really change the tide, to demand the resources that we need, and to support each other.
I had a friend who said, now is the time for coalition building. And
Mm,
it seems more apt now that we need to come together as organizations who are all in this fight to return our rights, our rights to bodily autonomy, our rights to self, and our
that's
rights
right.
to safety. I want to talk more about how we get people involved, because this is a big issue that touches people all across the country and really around the world. Personal safety for LGBTQ people it's not just an American issue, it's a global issue. And there are some places around the world that have much less access to safety than we do here in New York or here in the United States. So let's talk about how we can get people, really behind this idea of community-led safety. We've talked about how it's survivor focused. We've talked about how it's rooted in humanity and how it's really working to fix those core challenges. But that sounds easy, right? It sounds really simple to do. So
No
how do we get
problem.
it done? Yeah. How do we get it done, Bev? What can we do?
Well, there's lots of ways that we're already starting to do this work. And so if people want to, one, support that work, that is a very easy way to start. You mentioned coalition. I can't have this conversation without mentioning the amazing work that our staff has been doing, really to build intentional coalitions of folks and organizations across identity, to address particularly hate violence, but really all kinds of violence that we're experiencing right now. A few years ago, we started a coalition with a number of other groups called New York City Against Hate, and really understanding that um, this is a time where, as you said, many of us are under attack, and that we were hearing from folks in our community that you know they were experiencing violence in the street, in their communities, in their apartment buildings, and other people were not willing to stand up for them. And also, coming out of a time, particularly right at the beginning of the Trump administration, where we were seeing in New York City many more incidents of overt hate violence that, we hadn't really seen in that way in a while. And also, people in many communities, were saying, what can we do about it? How do we stop this? I feel like I'm seeing things that I haven't seen before, but I don't know what to do about it. And so we brought together this coalition um, with organizations that represent groups, folks who are, Muslim community, and folks who are in um, women's community, and of course the LGBTQ community and other communities of color, immigrants, um, and we've all come together and stayed united, really to share resources, to do intercommunity work around hate violence, so that we are not just building community led safety among LGBT folks, for LGBTQ folks, but we're recognizing that LGBTQ folks need to stand up for immigrant folks, and immigrant folks need to be standing up for, for women and for Muslims and for Jewish folks. And when we stand together, we're going to stand stronger. Because if you have a community that understands that hate violence against any of us is hate violence against all of us, we have a much stronger response to hate violence. So we've been doing things like training people to, you know, in some ways, do some of the things that we were describing when we talked about the Drag Queen Story Hour, to be upstanders in the community, to learn how to safely intervene, learn how to determine when it's safe to intervene. And if you can do so, learn what you can do to support somebody who you see is experiencing violence, who's being targeted. And not just make it individual, but think about what are the things that we can do together. And again, how do we, as communities together, shift resources so that those kinds of supports and programs can be funded, can be scaled across the city? We a few years ago had a first day against hate, and there were teach-ins all across the city where people were learning how to do some of this work individually. And it was amazing and powerful to see people hungry and wanting to take action. So, first thing that people can do is, if you're interested in anything like that, you can support AVP, you can support other of our partner organizations, and you can also come to a training and learn how to be an upstander, how you can start to implement community led safety on a very small individual level. And then you can get involved with one of our teams that are doing more work across the city, thinking about not just how do we do this as individuals, but how do we do it collectively as a group. And we are at Pride this weekend. So if people want to come out, either find us at Manhattan Pride. We'll be at Harlem Pride tomorrow. We're going to be talking to people about community-led safety. We're going to be giving people some tools and tips, and we're going to be building an organized community of folks who can do deeper visioning, who can build our own platform of what we need in this city for community led safety. And then we're going to be bringing that platform, those ideas, those proposals to our city council and government leaders and city officials and saying, okay, now we need your investment, we need your commitment. So there are lots of ways for people to join us.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on that piece about, elected officials, about those that are, we choose to represent us and the role that they play in helping to make these changes.
Hmm.
What can we do to make sure that they're holding up their end of the bargain and they're advocating for what we really need in community-led safety?
Well, I'm happy to say that this conversation is really beginning to take hold in our city and across the country. And so we need to keep that conversation going. Any opportunity that folks get to talk to city council members, to other city officials about this idea of communities owning, controlling, planning, having the funding to envision and put in place their own models for community safety. All of that is needed. Any conversations you can have with folks. If you have questions about what to say or who to say it to, you can definitely contact AVP. Our organizing team will give you lots of resources. We also on our website have lots of talking points that are available for folks. So if you want to get involved but you don't know how to say it or what to say, we have some tools available for folks. So starting there, but also, if you're intimidated about talking to city officials, you can talk to your neighbors and your family members and really think about, every time, um, you know, there are incidents of violence that are happening every day. Um, you know, we just learned earlier today of an incident that happened over the weekend, um, a hate violence incident right along where the Pride route is going to be happening on Sunday. And as you hear about those incidents in our community, those are opportunities to talk to folks about not just what do we do to find and punish the people that cause harm in those instances, but what could we have done to prevent it from happening? What can we do to protect the next person? Because these incidents are going to continue to happen in our communities and in other communities until we really make a large commitment to prevention. Um, and we can no longer be really just thinking about response to violence. We have to be thinking about what are the conditions, what do we want our city to look like so people can generally be safer. Doesn't mean that we're going to get rid of all harm and all violence. Um, Unfortunately, I don't think that that's going to happen in my lifetime. However, I do believe that the steps that we take now can help create the um, the foundation so that that might one day be a possibility. Really engage in folks around you and challenge folks' assumptions about what we think about when we think about safety. and really ask yourself, is that going to make you safe? Is having, more armed folks on the street, will it make you safer in reality? Or will it make some folks in our community feel safer, but actually raise the potential for harm for other folks? Because I think that's the other thing that we haven't talked about enough, Ori, today, is the fact that not only are most marginalized folks the folks who are most likely to experience violence, harmed in all kinds of ways in our society, but those are the folks who are actually going to be most harmed by those institutions of punishment. They're most likely going to be seen as the people who have caused the crime, the people who might cause the crime, the people who don't really belong on the streets, the people who will be targeted directly and indirectly by those forces that we put in place to punish folks. And we see that over and over again, right? That the marginalized folks in society are those most harmed by police. And at AVP, we hear over and over again so many stories of people being re-victimized, being harmed when they interact with the criminal legal system, whether by choice, when they're reaching out for help, or not by choice. And so if we can all be challenging what we think about will really make us safe, and again, be thinking about not just what will make me safe, but what will make others more safe in our community, that's a huge place to start.
I think that absolutely is a huge place to start. Start with empathy, start with listening to community, start with finding out what your neighbors need to help themselves feel safe. I think that's a great place to leave our conversation, Bev, on community safety. But this is going to keep on going. We still need to build this model and we really need you to be involved. So I'm going to talk about some ways that you can get involved on how we reimagine new models of community safety, not just for LGBTQ folks, but our society at large. And if you take one thing away, know that we need you to make this change happen. I just said that and I want to reiterate it because we want you to join our efforts to reimagine community safety. So you can visit the Our Pride, Our Safety page and sign the pledge to join our campaign. That's at avp.org/our safety. We've got frequently asked questions on that page, information on how you can share our campaign with your friends to start to have these discussions. We've got 4th of July coming up. Sometimes you might have to have some difficult conversations with some family members. We have some resources for you to be able to do that, to talk about community safety with your friends and family. Keep connected with us on social media. We can be reached at Anti-Violence there, and share your stories, share your information with us. We want to help you be engaged. So stay with us through this campaign and we'll be giving you more ways to be engaged over the course of the summer and beyond. Now, we'll be out this weekend at Harlem Pride and New York City Pride. It is Pride weekend here in New York City, and we want to make sure that you can come volunteer with AVP, or you can learn about community safety in person this weekend. Visit our events page to find out more information. You can get to it right from that Our Safety page at avp.org. And if you experience or witness violence this weekend or anytime, know that AVP is always there for assistance 24 hours a day. You can call or text us at our hotline at 212-714-1141. And finally, AVP helps thousands of New Yorkers with the generous donations of our friends and family and our supporters. And if you're able to help AVP continue this important work, you can visit our page at avp.org/donate. Thank you so much for watching this conversation and joining us for Reimagining Our Safety. I'm Orie Givens, and for Bev Tillery and all of us at AVP, have a happy and safe Pride weekend. And thank you for watching. Bye, everyone.